Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice Podcast. I'm Shane Phillips. We've got two guests for this one, Professor Eva Rosen of Georgetown University and Professor Philip Garboden with the University of Hawaii. Eva and Philip are co-authors on a bundle of research articles about how landlords operate, based on more than 100 landlord interviews across 4 cities. As we discuss, these were fairly intensive interviews that were accompanied by eviction court visits, ride-alongs with sheriffs who were executing evictions, and following along with some landlords in their day-to-day work. This is very much a qualitative body of research with an emphasis on learning how landlords think in their own words. What they found is fascinating, and in some cases really surprising too. Each article takes on a different aspect of landlording. First is the use of repeated eviction threats and filings, but not necessarily executed evictions that actually force tenants to vacate, as a tactic for collecting rent and also simply to gain leverage over tenants. The second is about how landlords choose their tenants and the legal as well as illegal methods that they use to discriminate between applicants and find quote-unquote good tenants. The third article is how landlords see themselves and their tenants in moral terms, paternalistic terms. We unfortunately run out of time before talking about that last one, but you'll pick up on that theme throughout this interview. I do want to note that we jump right into talking about evictions without ever really explaining the whole eviction process. That's partly because it varies quite a bit from place to place, which is itself a big problem for researchers interested in comparing eviction rates and outcomes in different states. But for anyone interested, we've included a general overview of how evictions work in our show notes. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and we receive production support from Claudia Bustamante and Olivia Arena. Send me your feedback or show ideas at shanephillips@ucla.edu, and don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and review if you're a fan. With that, let's talk to Eva and Philip.
Eva Rosen is associate professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. She does a lot of great research on poverty and U.S. housing policy. She is no stranger to the UCLA Lewis Center, as in the very early pandemic times, we hosted her to speak about her book, The Voucher Promise, Section 8 Housing and the Fate of an American Neighborhood. It's a great book and is the winner of book awards from both the American Sociological Association and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. We're also joined, I believe this is the first time we have a double guest, so this is a special episode.
Second time.
Second time. Okay, 2 for 2. We're also joined by Phil Garboden. He is also an outstanding scholar on poverty and U.S. housing policy and a frequent collaborator of Eva's. Phil is the HCRC professor in affordable housing and assistant professor at the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization and Department of Urban and Regional Planning. He has done a lot of great work on housing, including issues of housing mobility and landlords, which we will talk about today. And hello, Shane Phillips, our illustrious host. I kick it to you.
Hey there, Mike, and welcome, Philip and Eva.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So as we always do, we will start with a tour here, or 2 in this case. We'll ask that you keep things brief since we got a lot to go through here, and 2 guests just add a bunch more. But if you were giving us a tour around, say, your hometown, a place that you have lived and loved, and you wanted to show it off, where would you want to take us? I think we could start with Eva here.
Sure. So DC is not my hometown, but it's where I currently live. And this might be cheating, but I'll be honest, one of my favorite ways to tour a city is through a housing tour. Phil actually gives a great housing tour of Baltimore, if you ever need one of those. DC is a really interesting place when it comes to housing because it's sort of a city of extremes. So it has a lot of tenant protections, but it's also really very developer friendly. And of course, it has this dual population of the typical Capitol Hill, Washington type who has a fair bit of money to spend and may not even live in the city full time, but then also a longstanding Black middle class and working classes who have been historically sort of confined to certain areas of the city and are now being pushed out to areas like Prince George's County. And whenever I want to show students what racial segregation looks like on a map, I show them Washington, D.C. because the Black-white dividing line is just so stark. But despite these divisions, I think it's an incredibly diverse place where people really do come together from all different walks of life to try to solve problems, both through formal channels, but also informal ones. And so it's, of course, known for its like Washington with a capital W politics. But the local politics are really fascinating to watch and be a part of. And I think that's especially true when it comes to housing, which we'll talk about a bunch today.
And Philip?
Yeah, my hometown is a lovely place called Framingham, Massachusetts. It's a commuting suburb of Boston. It exists and continues to exist and house my mother, but beyond that, I don't have much to say about it. So I'll focus on the two cities I know best, which are Baltimore and Honolulu. I moved to Honolulu a few years ago from Baltimore, and I think what's been really interesting about that transition is you have two cities that really could not be more different from a housing market perspective, right? Baltimore has 16,000 houses that nobody wants that are abandoned. And in Honolulu, a postage stamp size piece of land is worth, $1 million at this point. So, and yet the sort of struggles that low income and poor families face in both places are astoundingly similar. So it's been a really interesting lesson, a sort of personal comparative urbanism to see the ways in which very different causes create strikingly similar outcomes for certain populations. I'd say the one large difference, and the one I think that's always very interesting to talk about in Honolulu, is the role that Native Hawaiians play in land use and politics here. In Baltimore, it's very easy, and I think all too easy, to forget the indigenous peoples of Central Maryland. But here, due to a lot of historical factors, those issues are much more pressing. And before I came here, I hadn't really thought much about the possibilities of sovereignty and of sovereignty movements and the ways that make land use even more complicated, and certainly make the role of a researcher from the East Coast all the more complicated. So it's a fascinating place to do housing work.
Yeah, and I feel like if Framingham is looking for a new motto, it exists. is a ringing endorsement if there ever was one.
Put that on the sign.
Welcome to Framingham. It exists.
We're here.
So we are discussing two papers in this episode. The first in the journal City and Community and authored by Eva and Philip, titled Serial Filing: How Landlords Use the Threat of Eviction. The second article is in American Sociological Review and titled Racial Discrimination in Housing: How Landlords Use Algorithms and Home Visits to Screen Tenants. And this one has an additional author, Jennifer Casaleon. There is actually a third paper by Eva and Philip about landlord paternalism, which we may be able to touch on, but we'll at least include in the show notes in any case. The first and third papers draw from 127 interviews with a random sample of landlords and property managers in Baltimore, Dallas, and Cleveland, and the one on racial discrimination adds 30 interviews in Washington, D.C. So that's part of why we're packaging all of these together in this conversation. To summarize really quickly, the first paper looks at how landlords and property managers use the threat of eviction much more frequently than they actually evict tenants, often as a way to strengthen their position in the landlord-tenant power dynamic, and especially as a way to collect late rent. The second paper evaluates the landlord-tenant relationship at an earlier stage, during the application process to move into a rental unit. It focuses on the ways that landlords discriminate between potential tenants in various ways, including by race, but also how screening methods differ between landlords with large portfolios and mom and pops who own maybe just a few units or a few dozen units. The last paper is about landlord paternalism, how landlords see their tenants and themselves in moral terms, how they use different strategies, most of them punitive, to, quote, train their tenants to become more responsible and self-reliant, and in the process, more profitable, ultimately, to the landlord. So that's a loaded topic, of course. We will kick things off with the serial eviction paper, and I think a good place to start is the distinction you make between evictions and evicting. Philip, starting with you, tell us what you mean by those terms and why the distinction is important for understanding the landlord-tenant dynamic, and maybe what we miss by focusing so much on evictions themselves, the point when the tenant is actually removed from their home. We've discussed the harms people can suffer from eviction in episode 12 with Elizabeth Delmel, and somewhat also in episode 7 with Kristen Perkins. But I think a quick overview of what we know of the harms of both eviction and evicting would be really helpful here.
Wonderful. I think that's a really important distinction that we were trying to get across the paper between the sort of moment of eviction, right? The sort of removal of a family from a home involuntarily, and what we see as, for some families, really a never-ending cycle of evicting, which has very meaningful but different impacts on their well-being. You know, when we wrote the article, in some ways it was a response to a lot of eviction research. This was very early on in the days of eviction research, which was only a few years ago, that a lot of papers were sort of conflating the two. They were sort of assuming that every filing more or less resulted in an executed eviction. And that's just fundamentally not the case. And I think the literature has moved very well in the direction of really seeing them as connected, obviously, but distinct phenomenon. The city that really made it the most obvious to us, this sort of cyclical process, was Baltimore. So Baltimore has a somewhat unusual eviction process insofar as the first formal warning between a landlord and a tenant, which usually happens basically through a certified letter in a lot of other places, actually creates a paper trail, an administrative paper trail in Baltimore that very much creates logistical problems for the court, but allows you to sort of see a part of the eviction process that is often invisible to researchers through traditional survey means. And so I assume the numbers have changed somewhat recently with the chaos of the last few years, but prior to the pandemic, Baltimore was seeing about 180,000 eviction warnings happening every year, and there's only about 110,000 rental households in the city of Baltimore. So it was really clear that not every renter household was getting formally removed from a unit, and the importance of sort of taking that whole process as distinct. So, in Baltimore, that there's 180,000 warnings, there's then 30 to 40,000 court adjudications, and then about 7,000, 8,000 families are sort of formally evicted each year, although, the degree to which those result in mobility that hasn't already occurred is still an open question. And so even though that last number is still shockingly high, we felt like a lot of what's going on within the eviction world is happening in those initial stages of landlords using the threat to eviction essentially as a form of rent collection, of forcing tenants to prioritize rental payments over other financial needs that household might have at a given moment.
Yeah, I would just add that sort of interestingly in the popular, as Phil said, I think the academic literature has moved to really make this clear distinction between the process of filing for eviction and the actual executed eviction itself. I think surprisingly among local politicians, certainly in a city that I know well, there's really still just a huge conflation between the filing and the actual executed evictions, and like an incredible misunderstanding, therefore, if you are only considering actual evictions, far fewer people are affected by the process. Whereas if you take into account some of these earlier stages, whether it's the official filing, which is documented everywhere, or in the case of Baltimore, as Phil pointed out, that pre-filing notice, there's just a much larger population that is affected. And of course, while eviction itself has, all kinds of very well-researched effects on households, like, kids doing less well in school, or parents losing their jobs, or mental health effects. I mean, the latest paper during COVID, right, the big paper that shows that eviction was associated with a much higher death rate during COVID times, right? So we know that eviction itself has all of these really tangible effects, but the emotional toll, I think, of knowing that your housing situation is unstable is really tremendous. And beyond the emotional toll, we know that the filing record, right, the fact of having your name in the court database, whether or not it resulted in an eviction, is really, really bad for tenants. It results in a much more difficult process of finding housing in the future. So, and this is something that directly came up in our interviews with landlords and has been sort of established in other ways since then. Landlords, when they look at a tenant's residential history, they do not distinguish between a past filing versus a past eviction. It's sort of like, in the criminal context, being charged with something versus being convicted of something, as if those were the same things, right? So this is a huge problem. And then if you take a city like DC, which has a very high filing rate, it can tell us a lot, I think, about how broken the eviction system is. So something like 1 in 9 renter households in DC gets filed on every year. But 95% of those filings never make it to an eviction, and 70% are dismissed by the judge outright. And most of the time, this is because the tenant has actually paid in between the time the filing was made and the time they get up in front of the judge. So as Phil pointed out, this sort of tells us that landlords are using the court as a debt collection agency, and this is not the best use of our judicial system, clogging up the cases with courts where tenants have actually paid by the time they get in front of the judge, and that allows the court less time for the more complicated cases that actually do need adjudication. So it's not until you make this distinction between evicting and eviction, or between eviction filing and executed evictions, that you can actually see some of these processes that are so important for all kinds of different policy reasons.
So that makes me think about how different it is in the California context in some ways, right? Like, as I understand it, in California, if you have an eviction petition filed against you, but you successfully fight off that petition or it's dismissed, your record is sealed, and therefore, that's not going to come back to haunt you as you're searching for housing down the road. I mean, is it kind of that simple, that some states have those protections, some states don't, and therefore the paper trails is very different in that way?
Yeah, what I will say is that I think even, and I don't know exactly how it works in California, but I know that DC has recently passed a record sealing law that in theory is supposed to do the same thing. So cases that are dismissed in theory get essentially sealed. The problem is that the way this works functionally is that landlords are not actually looking in the court databases to get this information. Most of the time, they're subscribing to software that these third-party aggregators put together, and those third-party aggregators are scraping websites constantly all day long every day. And so if that record appears as a filing even for 5 minutes in the system, maybe not 5 minutes, but if it's there for some chunk of time, it's going to get into that third-party database, and landlords are going to be able to use it to make decisions about who to rent to. So my sense is that even in the California case, unless that record was sealed from the get-go and then unsealed, in the cases where it was dismissed, then we actually still have a problem. And this is exactly what I meant when I said that politicians don't quite get this distinction. They're still, in many cases, I think, missing how to actually do record sealing in a way that would really durably protect tenants.
I think your question also speaks to just how hyper-local eviction policies have been historically in this country. Before the last 10 years or so, when folks were starting to think nationally about eviction as a national crisis, states and even specific jurisdictions, specific court systems were really doing it on their own and not really communicating across bounds. And so anything that's true of eviction in California is going to look very different in Georgia, is going to look very different in Baltimore, in ways that certainly make data analysis much more complicated, because even what is a filing and what shows up as a filing is going to be very different between those different places. So there's definitely a lot of data cleaning involved in this work.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said earlier, this first paper on serial eviction filing centers on the role that rent debt plays in the power dynamic between landlords and tenants, and how threats of eviction are used to kind of assert that power. That leads us to another distinction that you make between the owner-renter relationship and the creditor-debtor relationship, and how the relationship shifts from the former to the latter once rent debt is introduced. The owner-renter relationship is fairly symmetrical, at least in theory. Both parties have duties and responsibilities to the other. The owner has to keep the building and common areas in good repair and can't make demands of the renter not spelled out in the lease. And the renter has to pay rent on time and not damage the property or disrupt, the common areas or the lives of their neighbors, just for a few examples there. The creditor-debtor relationship also imposes duties on both parties, but in different ways. Eva, why is the shift from owner-renter to creditor-debtor so important in your view?
Yeah, so when tenants know that they are financially indebted to landlords, and this could be because they've had a formal eviction filing against them, or it could be just that they've talked to their landlord and they know that they're in arrears. But once they're in that situation, and especially once there's this sort of legal name on that situation, tenants may be less likely to report problems in the home. So anything from a leaky faucet to like something much worse, like a broken HVAC system, they may not tell the landlord, or they may be worried about reporting that to the city for fear of being put out because they actually owe rent, right? And then from the landlord's perspective, this power that they then have allows them to defer these costly maintenance expenses because they know that the tenant might be afraid to report the problems. So this fact of indebtedness, and especially the legal situation of having that eviction filing against you, can really change the dynamic between the landlord and the tenant. And it does so in ways that benefit the landlord and can compromise the tenant's housing situation.
I think one of the interesting ways to think about this question is to look at the rental context in which it doesn't occur. And so the example that comes to mind are landlords who rent to sort of young professionals in the District of Columbia, right? Folks who are renting not because they're low income, not because they couldn't afford to buy, but because they're transitory, right? A lot of folks go in and out of DC, work for a political candidate for a few years and leave. And when we talk to those landlords, they're not thinking about their tenants as debtors. I mean, of course, they expect their tenants to pay rent on time, but they're focused on customer service. They're focused on getting their tenants to renew their leases. They're focused on getting their tenants to tell their friends that this is a good building to live in. And I'm sure those tenants have all sorts of micro complaints about the particular landlords in the particular buildings, but broadly speaking, we see much more balanced power dynamics in markets like that. But in the low-end market, and low-rent market, you have landlords who are essentially competing with all the other needs that a low-income family has and the very limited and highly volatile income they have with which to make those needs. And so it's very important to landlords in those contexts to shift that relationship, to sort of try to unbalance that power dynamic through the threat of eviction, essentially, to ensure that they're getting rent income and that that's prioritized over, the broad set of needs that families have when they don't have enough money to cover all of them. So I think it's interesting to look at those negative cases as well.
So in those lower income markets, the landlords are competing for, getting the rent before the tenant might have to pay utilities or for food or their car payment, those kinds of things.
Yeah, any number of needs that a family has for investments in their children, investments in their family, other things that they might need to spend money on in a given month, there isn't enough to go around. And so the landlord has to make sure that they're the number one priority, which is largely true anyway. Rent needs first, but having that debtor relationship with your landlord definitely enforces that dynamic.
The filing can also prompt tenants to go to their social networks or their kin networks and ask for money, or to go to local charities or apply for emergency rental assistance. And so in some cases, it's not reprioritizing the expenses they have, but sort of tapping into other resources that they, for all kinds of reasons, might not have wanted to tap into.
This is maybe getting to a spoiler part of the episode, but the landlords frame it quite differently a lot of the time, right? In terms of prioritization. I mean, I think they're also thinking about prioritization, but they're more describing their tenants as irresponsible and, financially making poor choices. And, I don't know if now's the time to talk about that, but, it strikes me that that's kind of what we're talking about it in one way, and the landlords talk about it in a much more loaded way, right?
Yeah, I think that, there are very pervasive narratives around poverty in this country and internationally that, people believe poor folks, if they get some kind of income, spend it on luxury goods, on recreation, on things that aren't a priority. And my sense of the literature is those ideas don't hold up to rigorous scrutiny, right? When you look at what actual low-income folks are spending money on, it's not that they never spend any money on anything pleasant for them, but that they're spending the vast majority and prioritizing rent, prioritizing food, prioritizing investments in children as the bulk of what they're spending money on. And I think we saw that during the pandemic, right? When folks lost jobs, when renters lost jobs, they didn't immediately stop paying their rent,
No.
right? A lot of folks did everything they could, including, as Eva pointed out, leveraging their social networks, pulling money from where they could to make rent. And so yes, landlords very much embrace this idea of they need these things to help their tenants make sensible financial decisions. But ultimately, we see those cases as more the exception than the rule. And the rule in any rental market or any housing market is folks doing everything they can to afford rent. And the reality is there is enough money to go around in some cases.
Also, Mike, to your point, I think what landlords would say is, well, if a tenant is late on rent, why wouldn't I file for eviction as soon as I'm allowed to do so, knowing that they may pay, and then I can just go ahead and cancel the filing, no big deal. But why would I not initiate that process immediately so that I have the best chance of getting the money that is owed to me as soon as possible? And there's definitely a logic there, right? There's a strong logic there. I think the problem is that, and this is where the data is really, really helpful, and in a separate project looking at these numbers for DC, we sort of were able to confirm a lot of our suspicions on this. But what the data show, right, is that tenants are paying most of the time. Some of them are paying late. Some of them are paying late every single month. Maybe they get paid on the 15th of the month instead of the 1st, and they're just 2 weeks behind, right? And so what I say to, in situations where I'm asked to hypothetically respond to those landlords is I say, well, look, like from a policy perspective, if the issue is just that people are paying late, which is what the data shows, not that they're trying to shirk responsibility for their rent, then, why not knock on their door and just check in with them before you go ahead and make that filing? Now that we know how detrimental these filings are, let's check in with people and see if there's a way to get that money before doing that official filing. And then we have the added sort of positive side effect of not clogging up the courts with these basically frivolous cases.
Mm-hmm.
For all three of these articles, as I said, you sort of have the same or overlapping sample of landlords. Could you tell us a little bit about the sample itself? I don't think we need to get into the methodology of how all of them are selected. We can suffice it to say that you just sought a diverse sample of landlords in all 3 or 4 cities. But is there any way that you would group these landlords together, or any trends you saw, in terms of their assets, their background, what kinds of neighborhoods they rent in, anything like that?
Yeah, we have a lot to say about methodology, but at the basic level, our goal was to avoid the type of sampling that gets a subset of each market, right? What we did was try to get landlords in all different market niches, all different types of neighborhoods, all different levels of assets, types of buildings, things like that, to really try to capture that full heterogeneity. We did explicitly undersample landlords of luxury units. We just needed to spend our resources on the places where the policy problems exist, and so the highest end rental units are not considered in our findings. But generally, I think we achieved that heterogeneity really well. And landlords are very diverse. They're diverse in gender. They're diverse in race. They are everyone from somebody who owns a property they used to live in and moved and didn't want to sell and are sort of renting it out very informally, to a large corporation that owns an 800-unit rental development in someplace like Dallas. We had written a lot about how different types of landlords behave differently, act differently among the tenants. Really, the biggest vector that divides landlords in pretty much all of our studies is professionalization, right? It's the degree to which you are an individual operator who's owning and sort of managing your own units, sort of doing it on your own, versus a large company that has professional, sometimes third party, sometimes in-house management of the units. And the differences there are just very stark. I can give you an example from the screening paper that I know we'll talk about in a bit. When we talk to the professional property managers of these large apartment complexes, their lives are incredibly routinized and incredibly formal, often in ways to specifically avoid any sort of fair housing lawsuits, but also just in general, that's how they do their business. And so we had property managers talk about everyone who visits, they have to fill out a visit card, they have to monitor how they greet the tenants and the prospective tenants who walk through the door. Everything is very formal and by the book. And on the other side, we have landlords, even if they own, 20, 30 rental properties, who are just incredibly informal. These are the folks who collect rental application fees and never actually file, base their opinions of whether a tenant is useful on sort of chatting with them, sort of evaluating how they look, how they act. And so we really get that strong distinction. And so most of our findings break down pretty heavily along that line. You have the professional management on the one hand, and the sort of more idiosyncratic, some people use the term mom and pop, although that always has a bit of normative feel to it. The smaller sort of DIY landlords, on the other hand.
Among other problems, yeah.
And I do want to note here just the incredible amount of effort that must have gone into this data collection. You say in the papers, these are, with each of these landlords, we're talking about roughly 2 hours per interview, ethnographic observation of a subset of these landlords in their day-to-day activities, time spent in housing courts, riding along with the sheriffs during their evictions. It just seems like this must have taken many months, if not years, to accumulate all this data, right? And then to clean it all up and put it all together. So kudos to you just on that aspect of this, in addition to everything else.
Definitely took a number of years, I'll say, and
Yes.
we're not done.
That was my assumption.
But I just wanted to add to that, when it comes to sort of thinking about different kinds of landlords and different sort of clusters of approaches, one of the interesting things we found was whether it was around professionalization or around different strategies related to eviction or approaches to engaging with the voucher program, like all of these different topics that we were engaging with, we found sort of all the types of landlords in all of the 4 cities, even though they're very different cities. They just sort of existed in different amounts in different cities. So if we take like the folks who really specialized with the voucher program, like you see the most of those guys in Baltimore, where the voucher program can be very profitable for a lot of reasons that we shouldn't even get into here because it's a whole other topic. But we also see them in DC. They're just in certain neighborhoods, in certain places, in certain kinds of markets. And so having the 4 different cities with very different political and social contexts sort of allowed us to think really carefully about how these different approaches varied.
Yeah, I can't help but to think of some of the work that we did in Los Angeles, along this distinction between, more professional landlords or larger landlords and this goofy mom and pop cuddly moniker that we bestow upon a very select group of landlords that always comes up when you're trying to do something about landlords or renter protections, but that's another conversation. And, it's interesting because, especially in recent years, like with really large, financial or, companies getting access to a lot of property, a lot of rental property, being really, really big landlords, et cetera, like that seems to be kind of the demon in a lot of these stories. And like, during COVID in Los Angeles, like to the extent that our survey data was good, it's certainly a lot lower work rate data than you all collected in your work. But we found that it was much, much more likely that you're going to have an eviction or other kind of negative outcomes pushed against you as a renter who's late or not paying rent, if it's somebody if it's somebody who's like this quote unquote mom and pop, if it's somebody that owns just a couple properties or whatever. And, I think that just gets to kind of, what I think Phil was talking about, which is that these large institutional landlords do things very much by the book, right? And by the book during a lot of COVID was like, you're not supposed to evict people. So they didn't, threaten eviction because that was supposedly not on the table. So, it's just kind of interesting. I think work like yours, especially, like really kind of changes the frame a little bit about, not necessarily who's like a good and bad actor, but like at least adds a whole lot of nuance to this dichotomy as we usually see it in politics.
Yeah, that's a really important thing that I think is starting to come out in the literature more and more. There's lots of good work that shows that these large corporate landlords much more likely to file for eviction, much more likely to execute evictions, tend to be much more strict around behavior in a unit. There are, as you say, real trade-offs there, though, in terms of they also mostly follow the law, right? And if you can create a law that is followable and enforceable, they will implemented as part of their practices. All of the cases where we saw direct discrimination, for example, explicit, not implicit, not in any of the complicated ways that we think about discrimination these days, but direct discrimination, direct ignorance of rules around eviction, direct punitive approaches, illegal punitive approaches. These are all in the small landlord category, just because they're invisible to most of our enforcement mechanisms, and they can do these things. And so there really are complicated trade-offs, and that's why I try to avoid taking that sort of normative approach of these landlords are better, these landlords are worse. It's what do these landlords do? How does that impact tenants? What do these other types of landlords do? How do they impact tenants? And what can we do from a policy perspective to bring them all into ways that, benefit tenants to the degree feasible? So it's an absolutely important point you just brought up.
Yeah, there's two things I would say. One is that if you look at this separate study that I've been working on with Brian McCabe on the DC eviction data, it shows really clearly that larger landlords are more likely to file, but smaller landlords, when they file, those filings are more likely to result in eviction. So smaller landlords are filing less frivolously, and their filings are more likely to actually kick the tenant out, which may indicate that there was a good reason to file. But at the same time, to Phil's point, I think what you see with the smaller landlords is that it's all over the map. You've got your do-gooders who grew up poor, who really want to help people and provide housing for poor folks, and then you've got folks who are breaking the law, who are doing lots of discriminatory stuff. I mean, those were the people who admitted to us their biases. I admitted is not even the right word. Like, they had no qualms about being discriminatory and sharing that with us for the most part.
And I feel like those do-gooders too, they get used as like a political meat shield when tenant protections or any kind of reform is proposed, where it says, well, what you're going to do is you're going to make it impossible for these do-gooders to operate in the way they've been operating, ignoring the fact that the vast majority of people do not have these, do-gooder landlords, not even saying that they're bad, just like they're not doing more than they need to in most cases, because it's a business like any other ultimately. And that's always been a frustration for me is this idea that a few do-gooders means that we just shouldn't regulate this market any more than we do now.
For sure. I've heard that come up again and again in these local political conversations, and it's really hard to figure out where to go from there.
Mm-hmm. This is maybe a good transition, but I feel like this is probably coming out as we're talking here. Landlords mostly don't come across in a very positive light in your articles. And it's not really that you're attacking them or anything. You're just kind of communicating the things they've said and that they do. But you spend a lot of time with them. And I wonder if you developed any sympathy for their perspectives in one way or another. One thing that I was thinking about is how landlords mostly seem to be acting rationally within a system that rewards a kind of heartlessness. And that's a system that we set up. To be a kind and forgiving landlord within that context, within that policy context, might also mean being an unprofitable landlord or one who can get taken advantage of. You write in your second paper on discrimination, quote, "We are not asserting that better or different landlords would result in fundamentally different outcomes. All landlords, racist or anti-racist, white or non-white, exist within a system whereby profitability and thus housing stability is inexorably linked to processes of exclusion." I'd be curious to hear either of your reflections on that quote or how you felt about the landlords you spoke to just more generally.
Yes, this is a really important point. And I think we both absolutely developed sympathy and fondness for the task that many landlords face. To me, it comes down to not basing either your social science or your public policy on sort of assessments of are landlords good or bad or behaving sort of altruistically. What we have to think about is incentives and systems and the sort of context they're responding to. And I think one of the places where our sympathy comes through is that the United States has really asked landlords, private landlords, to do impossible things in our social system, right? We know that only 1 in 4 families who are eligible for some kind of housing subsidy, or 1 in 5, or the numbers differ slightly, but receive any kind of subsidy, right? So that means the vast majority of families who are making very low incomes are forced to find housing in a market in which it is very difficult to supply them housing at rates they can afford. I think back to one of my first academic papers with Sandy Newman, where we were looking at what are the rental properties that are actually renting at low rents, unsubsidized, but low rents, not who are renting to poor people, but who are renting at low rents. And if you look at those extant data, it's really sort of a morass for those things. It's, weird, unstable situations, people renting to family, people who are actually renting rental properties at rents that poor and low-income families can afford really aren't doing something that's sustainable, right? And they might have other reasons for doing it. And so what we're asking our landlording systems to do in this country is to take on all this responsibility that the government should really be a key partner in, but for a variety of political reasons simply isn't. And now, where I think we come across as, as you say, somewhat less sympathetic to landlords is that often the way to respond to this very difficult task, the way that landlords do respond to this very difficult task, is to implement systems of management, of screening, of eviction that are not beneficial to tenants, right? That sort of result in harms that tenants experience and often don't necessarily reflect well on landlords' ideology and perspective on why and how their tenants are doing. But in some ways, these are somewhat necessary conditions for profit making in some of these circumstances. And so I think it's really important when we talk about landlords not to engage in the sort of easy, social media conversation of these landlords are misbehaving, they're doing bad things, and really think about what is the market that they're responding to, what is the problem that we're trying to solve as a society around housing everybody, and then where are there major gaps? And those gaps do mean tenant protections, they do mean regulation, they do mean managing the acceptable behavior of landlords in these markets, but they also mean pretty direct investment in affordable and subsidized housing in our cities. And you can't just do one and not the other, depending on which of those is more politically palatable at the moment. You really need to be engaged on both sides if you want this to work for folks.
It does seem like there's an issue of competitive advantage or disadvantage where if you're trying to be the good landlord, you're going to kind of lose out. And maybe because you're buying a property from other people who don't want to be as good of a landlord, as kind of a landlord, you're going to pay more than you would like to. And that puts you in a position where you almost can't, keep the rent low or as low as you would like and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, a lot of people will take that as they'll just use that as an excuse to oppose any kind of like stronger protections and these kinds of things. But actually, to me, it seems like that's the only way this gets better, because we can't just ask individual landlords to be better. We have to demand that all of them and put them all on the same playing field and a more just playing field than the one we have right now.
Exactly. I mean, if your policy goal is dependent on landlords not exercising the market power that they have to charge high rents, to evict families, any of those types of things, then, as you say, the ones who are doing that because they have altruistic goals or just want to make sure they're doing right by their tenants, have histories in these communities, they're going to be sidelined by folks who are willing to make those decisions, who are going to therefore have more profitable enterprises, and so forth. And so unless you stabilize and standardize that rule that everyone needs to provide safe and sanitary conditions in the home, everyone needs to have a very formal and fair eviction process, you're going to have a sort of a lowest common denominator problem around profitability. So absolutely. If anything, it makes it more urgent that we have strict and standardized tenant protections.
In the conclusion of the serial filing paper, you discuss the potential for stronger protections that do more to favor tenants over landlords in eviction proceedings. But you also make a very good point that Cleveland and Baltimore already have laws, at least in this direction, and that they don't solve the problem of landlords gaining leverage when renters become debtors, and the things that they can do with that leverage. I didn't interpret this at all as an argument against additional protections, and I think this conversation we just had highlights that, but I'd love to hear you talk about the concern. Are there other types of reforms we should be thinking about that could maybe be more oriented toward alleviating the evicting part of the landlord-tenant relationship rather than only reducing the likelihood that tenants are ultimately evicted?
So one of the big interventions that I think flows pretty naturally from this work is in places like DC and Baltimore, is raising the fee to file. So in these two places, it has, until very recently, been set at about $15, which is the lowest in the country. The average fee to file for eviction across the country is about $100.
They might spend more on lunch that day.
Yeah. Yeah. Although you wouldn't know it from having conversations with folks about this who really, really have pushed back against the idea of raising the fee to file. But we think this is really important when we look at these very, very high filing rates. It's just too easy to file. And so this is one thing that we think can make a huge difference. We did make this recommendation based on the eviction research in DC, and they have passed. They have changed the fee to file to $100. Baltimore, Maryland, just this year, I know, was also considering similar legislation, and I have to check. I do not think it passed there. There was quite a bit more opposition to it. So that's one big thing. The other big thing that I've looked at in other work is sort of looking at eviction filings for very low sums. So from our data on the DC eviction project, we saw that 12% of evictions were being filed for under $600. Tenants owed under $600 and were still being taken to court. And we actually pointed this out in a separate report, and the council just banned filings for under $600, which is fantastic. And really,
are you feeling like you should have given the number for under
Yeah.
$1,500 instead?
So we just picked a random number. We picked a totally random number, and then this showed up in legislation. We were like, excuse me, just a minute. We'd like to revisit that. But I'm not sure it would have passed if it had been higher. So
it's a good start.
So, and the Eviction Lab has also done some really interesting work, particularly with that number of $600, which is why we picked it. I think it is just a random number, though. That being said, like things like changing the fee to file, banning evictions for under $600 or whatever amount you want to pick, these things don't fundamentally change the dynamics of housing affordability. But they do keep people out of courtrooms. So I think more broadly, as Phil was speaking to in what he was saying before, the biggest implication of our work, I think, is the need to expand permanent supportive housing. And certainly this is something I talked a lot about in the voucher promise. How do we do that in a way that expands access to more people, but also doesn't hurt their ability to make real choices about where they live?
So following up a little bit about costs, do the landlords you talk to, do they talk a lot about the costs of retaining counsel as a big part of what they're doing? And I think about some of Kyle Nelson's work. Who I know you're familiar with Kyle, and you've co-authored with Kyle. I've co-authored with Kyle. He's a doctoral student, he just graduated. Just graduated from UCLA like in the last week. Congratulations to Kyle if you're listening. So he's done a lot of work on the institutional life of eviction in the courts in not just Los Angeles, but in California more broadly. And one of the things that I've been struck by when I read his work is how much it costs landlords to constantly kind of go to court for, the repayment of rent. And again, people are not always super sympathetic to landlords, but those costs end up coming from somewhere, right? And so if it's the cost of doing business, it's going to raise rents for future tenants and what have you. So how much is that part of the equation for lawyers in the cities for landlords in the cities that you talked about?
I think that where we see this play out really is in the different habits of smaller and larger landlords again. Yeah. So for a landlord with a lot of properties, they're going to be retaining a lawyer. That person is going to be going to court in their stead for the most part in places where that's allowed. And it's going to be a pretty marginal cost for them. It's going to be part of the cost of doing business. For a small landlord who's not encountering these problems all that often, it is going to be a significant cost. And I think that's a big reason why landlords who have fewer properties are not filing like every month, like clockwork, as soon as the tenant is late. They're only filing on the people who they actually have a suspicion are not going to end up paying. And that's why those are the folks who, that they have a much higher rate of filings making their way all the way to execution.
I imagine that the different costs for smaller landlords versus these larger, more professional landlords also plays a role in how they screen their tenants. And smaller landlords may be feeling a little more like they need to be more particular. So that's a good transition here for the racial discrimination paper. And in this paper, you note that in many markets, due to a variety of structural and historical factors, you often have pretty racially homogenous applicants for housing. Many of us are probably imagining landlord discrimination, or racial discrimination in particular, as taking the form of favoring, say, white applicants over black applicants, which of course does happen very often. But in many markets, landlords are selecting between different households of the same race. That doesn't mean they don't engage in discrimination. It just means that if the discrimination is occurring, it's often more complicated than the simple model we might have in our heads, and not just based on race. As you put it, quote, in this context, racial discrimination exists not in the categorical favoring of one racial group over another, but in the process by which individuals within a marginalized racial group are adjudicated, end quote. Tell us a bit more about that. What are we missing when we think about racial discrimination as only operating between different racial groups and not also within them?
Yes, and I always like to start the answer to this question exactly how you started the question, which is that old school racial, gender, family size discrimination absolutely still exists. It's shown by rigorous audit studies, by many groups across the country. So when we're trying to sort of nuance and complicate these discussions, we very much do not want us to therefore pretend we're moved beyond the old school version. But the reality, and I think we're building off a lot of social science work here, is that a lot of neighborhoods are very homogenous racially, to say a not surprising truth. And that means that oftentimes the applicant pools for particular units will also be fairly homogenous, right? I mean, we have neighborhoods that are transitioning in any given city at any given point, but most neighborhoods are stably white, stably black. And then, depending on your market niche, you might be getting primarily male or female tenants. Obviously, if you have large units, you're getting more families, and so on and so forth. And so what we see in most of our data is not landlords who are usually making meaningful decisions between say a white tenant and a black tenant, but landlords who are deciding within an all black or an all white applicant pool which tenants are going to be most profitable, most likely to pay rent, least likely to harm the unit, and so forth. And then when we talk to landlords about how they're making those decisions beyond the obvious sort of credit screening and income lines, what we heard a lot are ways that they're making decisions that are based in what we believe to be fairly pernicious racist narratives of the black underclass, of poor communities, of women, of so forth, right? And so the sort of criteria they're using to distinguish from one tenant to another are based on what they think is the performance of irresponsibility, and that performance of irresponsibility is based in racial and racist narratives that we have in this country. So an example we use in the paper is sort of ideologies around black motherhood and responsibilities around motherhood. These are racist narratives as old as the United States. And what that means is that landlords in many ways will often scrutinize the mothering behavior of their applicants and these are, of course, the small landlords who are doing sort of informal screening processes when they're operating in low-income black neighborhoods, right? So looking at whether or not they believe the children to be clean or well-behaved is some sort of a symbol of whether or not that tenant is going to pay their rent reliably and so forth. And so obviously you're not taking race out of the equation, but you're using race in a way that distinguishes within a racial group rather than between racial groups, as also occurs.
And you note that larger, more professionalized landlords tend to rely on at least superficially objective screening criteria like income and credit history, while the smaller and mom and pop types more often go off of their gut feelings and use things like home visits and kind of more specialized questionnaires to try to get a sense for how good a tenant will be. That strikes me as another barrier for lower income or structurally marginalized populations. It's a lot less of a burden to fill out an automatic screening form than to have this invasive life evaluation by some stranger. But if you don't have a high or a reliable income, or if you don't have a good credit history, you're probably not going to score well on that simple, automatic screening. So you're kind of compounding disadvantages here, which isn't a new phenomenon in research about the lived experiences of poor people and other marginalized groups. But to take another side on this, it's probably better to have these alternative screening approaches rather than relying on just the one-size-fits-all that doesn't suit a lot of people. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Maybe we can just start by you summarizing these two different approaches and the reasons that different types of landlords tend to prefer one or the other. And I know I've certainly got some follow-ups and some clarifying in this as well.
Yeah, sure. So first, to just sort of summarize, what we find is that all landlords are trying to find what they call the good tenant, right? The right tenant for their property. And this is going to depend on where it's located, what kind of properties it has, what amenities it has, and also who they think they can reasonably attract and how much they think they can get. But the things that make a tenant fundamentally good, paying rent on time, not causing the landlord any extra headaches, these things are not really predictable. They're sort of fundamentally unobservable to the landlord at the time that they're really screening the tenant. It's just not possible to know this stuff ahead of time. So what do? Well, they rely on what we call these proxies, right? So when it comes to the smaller landlords, as you said, they're relying on what they call gut checks, which are these sort of informal judgments that they make about how tenants look, how they talk, how they present themselves. And this is, of course, when these stereotypes that Phil was talking about, stereotypes that are really at the intersection of, in the case of many of our tenants, poverty and Black motherhood. They draw on these stereotypes. They do home visits to see how tenants are keeping their homes. They smell the tenants' kids. They check to see how neatly their hair is combed. Really some quite invasive and insidious stuff.
I did want to say, too, like, as a white man, I was kind of shocked to read this. I don't know. I shouldn't have been. But like, I certainly have never had a home visit, in a place in advance of renting a place. That was never proposed to me.
Yeah, it was fairly common among a subset of our landlords, and it sort of varied by city. Mm-hmm. I think it was Baltimore and Cleveland where it was the most common, if I'm not wrong, Phil. And then you have larger landlords. On the other hand, they're going to be using these formal methods. They're often really trying, as we mentioned, to kind of systematize and routinize their procedures so that they can protect themselves from fair housing lawsuits, because they're much more likely to actually be audited by a fair housing check. And so they're relying on things that we think of as fairly standard, like credit checks, criminal background checks, residential history checks. And that's where that history of eviction or eviction filing comes in. And this may seem better. I think in a lot of ways it's quite a bit better. But the issue here is that these things, too, are not particularly good predictors of paying rent on time. Even credit checks are not particularly good at predicting someone's ability to pay rent. And on top of that, they tend to correlate with categories of historical inequality. So when we rely on formal algorithms that rely on these metrics to screen tenants, not we, but landlords are actually sort of just reproducing these same patterns that sort of created the data feeding into this algorithm in the first place.
Something that came to mind as I was reading this was the need to establish alternative, fairer systems, and not simply, if we don't like the home visits or the more kind of gut check approach, we can't just say, we're going to get rid of that. And because then everyone is just left with this formal screening process that's going to disadvantage people. And maybe it's actually better, at least than that alternative, to at least have that other option, which they might score a little better on, and they can make a personal appeal. I think about when I was younger, I had to use a payday lender several times. And while I 100% understand the arguments against them, I think I'd have been worse off had that option not existed for me at the time, if nothing else had taken its place. When it comes to housing, we banned a lot of the more affordable housing typologies in the past, boarding houses, single room occupancy hotels, to say nothing of just, multifamily housing generally in many places. But we didn't do much to make more socially desirable housing actually accessible to the people who lost those other more affordable options. So, do you have a sense for what you'd like to see in place of these existing screening methods? I found the paper super valuable and illuminating, but it kind of left me feeling like no screening method is going to fix these problems that are ultimately much bigger and more systemic.
Yeah, we really grappled with this question too, and especially at the urging of the reviewers, like, you got to give us something else. And so, ultimately, we think that it would be better to eliminate screening techniques that seem to serve no other function than as stand-ins for race, gender, class, right? So things like home visits and smell tests, these are definitely, obviously, not measuring a tenant's ability to pay. Credit scores, too, are really just this crude proxy for poverty and racialized exclusion from credit and home mortgages, and algorithms when they are used. We think this is where there's a little bit of room for movement. You can use an algorithm if it's predominantly relying on, say, income or voucher receipt in the place of income, right? Like, are you getting a paycheck that allows you to pay rent? Yes. Okay, then you qualify, right? That we think is a much more immediate proxy for whether or not the tenant's going to be able to pay than whether or not once in the past they weren't able to pay their credit bill, or whether or not once in the past they had an eviction filing that never went through, right? And, when it comes to these sort of more discriminatory practices, I think there's a whole conversation to have around how to hold landlords to account. And we think that that is incredibly important. But at the same time, we're also sort of pointing to a larger problem, right? Which is that rental assistance for low-income families in this country just is not sufficient to meet the demand. And we have all these private landlords who are, in many ways trying to meet that demand, but not always doing it very well, and in the process sort of attempting to mitigate their own risk by using these often racist, sexist, otherwise discriminatory screening tools to judge tenants' worth. So this is obviously something we can work on making better, but ultimately we do sort of want to shift the conversation from what's the best screening tool, which is always going to exclude the people at the bottom, whoever they are and whatever their traits are. And it can be done in more fair or less fair ways, but there's always going to be winners and losers, right? And sort of shifting the conversation to figuring out, okay, how do we actually make sure that everyone who needs housing has it? And so we didn't want to sort of leave readers without that central takeaway.
Yeah, I think the reason it seems in some ways a little hopeless is where really the question we're trying to ask is, how do you screen tenants into housing they can't afford, right? And that's impossible because they can't afford it, and therefore they're going to present potentially challenges to profitability on the landlord side. And it's easy to sort of punt to the labor market as housing researchers to say, oh, this is something that the labor folks need to solve. But income volatility in the low end labor market is a key piece of this story that we don't want to neglect. And I think, the system we have now, as you pointed out, is that folks who do well on paper tend to pursue formal landlords. People who don't do well on paper but can do well in a sort of a performative sense go for small mom and pops. And we see in other interview studies with voucher tenants that people are very explicitly taking these techniques and are very aware of what they need to do to sort of get through, find at least one landlord who's willing to take them in a metropolitan region. But without dealing with the fundamental income problem, we're going to have a substantial subset of the population that's going to keep struggling no matter how they're screened. And I think we know from other discrimination literature that when you take away tools that whether it's employers or landlords use to screen tenants, that you have to be really careful about what fills that void, right? And what fills that void is not always, equality, or it's oftentimes other even more deleterious techniques that even more disadvantaged women or people of color or large families and so forth. And so just a continued whack-a-mole, well, you can't screen on this, you can't screen on this, you can't screen on this, while in some of the cases that Eva pointed out, some of those things we think are probably good ideas to remove from the equation when they really aren't serving a fundamental business process. Ultimately, if you take away everything, you have to be very careful about what comes in and fills that gap. And so, to state the sort of boring thing again, right? Income support, rental housing subsidies, vouchers, and what have to be a part of this conversation as well.
I think that focus on the upstream, the structural, the more systemic factors is a good place for us to end here. But I hear that you have a book project coming up. Do you want to tell us about that before we let you go?
Yeah, sure. So Eva and I are currently working on a book called American Landlord. It's forthcoming with Princeton University Press. We'll be writing it over the next year or so. And it's our really goal to think, we've written a series of papers that you've so generously queried us about during this podcast. And it's an opportunity to think very holistically about the low-end rental market as a space and the role that landlords play within it. And a lot of the questions that we've talked about today around how do you separate these individual behaviors from the structural processes that incentivize those behaviors, and how you create a low-end market that's actually supportive of the obvious point that everybody needs to be housed by someone somewhere is our goal for the book. So we're excited to be able to sort of take a step back from these focuses on discrimination, of screening, of management, of eviction, and really think big about these questions.
Philip Garboden and Eva Rosen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us. This was a really fun discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we could have talked for many more hours, but this was terrific. Thank you.
We certainly could. Thank you. You can read more about Eva and Philip's research and find a whole mess of show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is there at MC_lens. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.